All right, guys, I have the pleasure of interviewing a great friend, a former colleague, Brendon Ziegler. He's at Cal State Bakersfield, had a long journey to get there, but just a pleasure having you on today, Brendon. Excited to chat. If you could just give us a kind of a snippet of your history, your journey that got you to Cal State Bakersfield, and then we'll go from there.
Well, first off, Nate, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. Thanks to the guys from Samson for putting this on. Any information that we can get to other strength coaches, I think is always helpful. A little bit about my background. I started off very early, very interested in the strength conditioning profession. Watched a demonstration by a strength coach when I was in ninth grade of a strength coach giving a power clean. And I thought to myself, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And so from a very early age, I knew that I wanted to choose this profession. Played football in college at a small school named Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Played there for 4 years and volunteered with my strength conditioning coach, Chris Hartman, as an intern throughout those 4 years. Between my junior and senior year, I decided I needed to do an off-site internship and chose the Chicago Bulls with Al Vermeil, Eric Allen, and Jeff Macy.
Nice.
And so that was a big part of my process. Getting a foundation under me as well from those guys was outstanding. And so I take a lot of what they taught me forward in the field. From there, I worked at University of Wisconsin, primarily with football, but some other sports as well, wherever they needed me kind of helping out. I was there for a while and then went to University of Hawaii. Spent some time there working with basketball, men's and women's, football, the tennis programs there. From Hawaii, I was offered a position at Oregon State University working with Jeff Macy, kind of circling back around to him. Was there 5 years. I worked with men's basketball, football, softball, and golf programs there. I met my wife, who was the assistant softball coach at the time, Chrissy Buck, now Chrissy Buck Ziegler. We met each other there and got married. When positions opened up at Cal State Bakersfield, she became the head softball coach, and I became the first ever director of strength conditioning for the school. So kind of a wild trip around the country, but this is where we're at.
That's awesome. I know we spent, it was a short period of time at Oregon State, and you were somebody I always really respected just in terms of how you treated people. You were so methodical, well thought out with your programming and your process. So pumped to ask you some questions today and dig a little bit deeper. I know you kind of had the whole gamut in terms of the college and saw a little bit of the professional world. Going to a smaller school like Cal State Bakersfield, what was the hardest adjustment for you in that process?
The lack of resources compared to the bigger schools of that was definitely an eye-opener. And they say, good talent's flexible. It really was tested, especially as we transitioned from the big school down to the smaller school. I can remember my first ever conditioning workout with basketball here. And it was about 110 degrees. At the time, we didn't even have an athletic trainer on staff. And we were trying to figure out if we could find a spot that we could run these athletes where it wasn't full of squirrel and gopher hose. It was just a completely different experience. And so I walked into a 1,200 square foot weight room with a few squat racks and tons of machine equipment, selectorized equipment, and had to figure out a way to make it work. And so the biggest difference is the resources, and you're used to things being very set up for you. When you have those Power 5 experiences, you're used to having a very regimented experience. And when you're at this level, it takes a lot of flexibility and a lot of adaptability because things change, practice times change. And so that's the biggest difference I've seen so far.
I mean, you talked about the lack of resources, and you don't have the flash. You're not in the arms race that some of these schools are in. What has that allowed you to do in terms of focusing on the basics? And what are your primary focuses with your process and the resources that you have?
Well, I think the primary focus should be the same whether you're at a small school or a big school, and I think it really comes down to your underlying foundation. And my time with the Bulls, talking to Al Vermeil and Eric Helen, the first thing they did is they sat me down and they said, "You need to develop a training philosophy." And that training philosophy is what you'll use moving forward to interpret new technology, new methods, and things like that. And I basically just borrowed their philosophy. And their philosophy was, we want to build the best athletes possible, the ones that can apply and absorb the force in the shortest period of time. And for an athlete, that's a lot of different directions. That's a lot of different magnitudes and things like that. So that same concept, taking it from a big school to a small school was fairly easy. We have to be a little bit more reserved with some of our exercises just because we don't have the equipment, space, and coaching sometimes. But for the most part, we really try to adhere to that philosophy. And so when we take a look at training, the nuts and bolts of training really hasn't changed. We still need to squat, we still need to pull, we still need to press, we still need to sprint, and we need to condition to sustain those things. The nice thing about this small school experience is it has exposed me to a lot of different sports. There's a lot of different personalities. There's a lot of different athlete types. Currently, we had 16 sports here at CSUB. When I first got here, we had 19 sports. And so there were sports like water polo I've never even worked with. And so figuring those little pieces out, I think is important. And so it's allowed me to kind of grow in terms of how I'm able to, adapt and change to each of those sports and each of those coaches and each of those athletes. So I think that's a big part of working at a small school and the advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. You really have to focus on development, and you have to trust your process because you're a one-man band. For a while, you were just you, which is tough, and that takes a lot of sacrifice on your end in terms of time and the effort that you put into that. So what keeps you going? What keeps your motivation at a high level? I mean, you've been doing this for a long time, and it does take a lot of time, energy, and sacrifices to put into this thing. So what are kind of your underlying passions, values that keep you going?
Yeah, and I was a below average athlete when I got into this profession, and I used the weight room and training to kind of get myself on the same level as everybody else to make myself competitive and football and the other sports I did. And so, I enjoyed the weight room. I enjoyed that process. And so that continues to be a big part of throughout my entire career. I enjoy athletes who work hard, who put in the effort, and receive some success, receive the payout from it. And hopefully that's wins and losses. That's really what we're in the profession for, is to really have the athletes have success on the field. I think throughout the years, I've determined the ancillary benefit of being in these athletes' lives is teaching them to become better people that are better prepared for the world and things like that. And so that's a great thing as well. But I've really enjoyed the process of training and the day-to-day coaching of it. I really enjoy problem solving. I think that's a big part of it as well. I like to anticipate things before they happen. I love the aha moments. So I think that's a big thing too, is just, keeping in tune with what's going on in strength conditioning. How can I apply that to our level, and try to identify problems in that.
No question. One of those big sacrifices that you gave up was your health. You had some health issues here in the last couple of years. You're on your second bout of cancer. Is that correct?
Actually, my third, technically.
Third, what?
Yeah.
Crazy.
So the year was 2013, and we were putting crazy hours in the weight room and at work and things like that. And I had noticed some symptoms started to develop. Started developing a cough, a rash, and kept visiting the doctor, and the doctor kind of shoved it off a little bit, and I kept going back to the doctor saying, "Man, I'm getting more tired. Something's not right." I started having night sweats. I started losing weight like crazy. I went from 260 pounds to 210 pounds. And finally, I was doing tempo runs with our basketball team on the field, and I couldn't even shout out the times because I was coughing so much. And so the doctor sent me to a pulmonologist, and the pulmonologist, had been told by the doctor that we were concerned about asthma or some lung conditions. He's like, "You don't have asthma." He's like, "You have lymphoma." And he's like, these lymph nodes sticking on your neck, we need to get those out tomorrow. And so the condition was misdiagnosed for probably almost a year. And so by the time I actually got chemo, and I did 6 months of chemo in that process, I actually felt a lot better throughout the whole chemo, which is, I think, pretty rare. I was able to keep working and not miss a beat on that. And because of that history of lymphoma, I was really sensitive to lymph nodes and things like that. And this past November, I had felt a lymph node just underneath my ear, what I thought was a lymph node. Went to my oncologist, who was fantastic here in Bakersfield, and I said, "Hey, I got this thing going on. It's been there a few weeks." He's like, let's get it ultrasounded. Ultrasound turned back something abnormal, and he said, "Well, let's go get a biopsy done." And they did a needle biopsy, and they came back with this crazy diagnosis. It was a neuroendocrine cancer of the parotid gland. And if you were to ask me a year ago where the parotid gland was, I wouldn't have any idea where this thing was. I could tell you where the carotid artery was, but the parotid gland, I had no idea. And it's the saliva gland on the side of your face. And the doctor really didn't believe that diagnosis. So the first thing he did is, let's go down to UCLA, let's go get it checked out by one of the best in the area. So I visited the doctor, and he's like, it says neuroendocrine cancer parotid. He's like, unless you're a unicorn, he's like, I don't think this is what it is. And so in January, I had surgery to remove that gland and that tumor. And what they do for that is they cut you on the side of the ear all the way kind of down your collarbone. They peel about a third of your face back to remove the gland.
Wow.
And I had told them I was a strength conditioning coach, and I do a lot of work overhead. I love weightlifting movements. I love snatching. I love jerks, things like that. And be able to demonstrate that was really important to me. So traditionally what they do is they move your sternocleidomastoid from, the position behind your head to cover up the gigantic hole they've created in your face, because they say it's about the width of your palm in thickness. And so I had said, this is an issue. And so what they did to compromise that is they split my sternocleidomastoid in half, put half it on my face, and left the nerve portion back there, so I remained strong overhead. And so I was able to do that, which was really great. They had 4 pathologists in the operating room. It's about a 5-hour surgery, and they couldn't make heads or tails of the tumor. They'd never seen anything like that before. They sent it off to a bunch of labs to have it checked out, and sure enough, it was this neuroendocrine cancer of the parotid gland, which is an extremely, extremely rare cancer. I can't tell you how many people have ever had it before, but my guess is under 10.
Crazy.
And in kind of the history of the world. And so as an incidental finding, they actually took out the lymph node adjacent to the parotid gland, and they found some thyroid cancer as well. And so the thyroid cancer just was found incidentally with that parotid gland tumor. So the one thing one of my oncologists said to me is, he said, we have a big hospital here at UCLA, and to see a metastatic cancer in somebody twice is really rare. He's like, 3 times is almost unheard of. And I said, well, is there any relation between all of them? He goes, no, you're just unlucky. Some people win the lottery twice. He's like, you just happen to get cancer 3 times in this. So sooner or later, I'm going to start playing the lottery and check those odds out.
No doubt. I mean, it's just been amazing just to see your mindset and how positive you've been, and you really attacked this thing. It's been amazing. How has this changed your perspective just on life and as a professional in the strength and conditioning industry?
I'd love to say that I had like a huge life-changing moment in all this. Obviously, I think you got to look to the man upstairs. I think he does a lot for everybody, and I think that's a big part of the way I look at things, and will still look at things because of this. I think sometimes you don't sweat quite the small stuff like you used to, but I'll be honest. I think the mentality that I had going into it really helped shape that process. Just worry about the day to day. Don't get consumed by the outcome, don't consume by the way you feel, things like that. And I think that process didn't change a whole lot through my treatment. And so I don't think I came out the other end of this with a huge, life-changing outlook on life. I think it's important to kind of keep perspective. And I think the things that have worked for me continue to work for me. So I feel pretty good about just, buying into the process and things like that. Obviously, um, throughout that process of treatment, there were some uncomfortable moments. You feel nauseated. I lost my taste for quite a while. All my food tasted like a 9-volt battery stuck to my tongue for a while. So the one thing coming out of this, I really enjoyed food and the taste of food a lot more than I did before. So,
Well, it's been amazing to see your strength. So, it's awesome. Hopefully it's a bit nice perspective, at least coming from your athletes that you work with. And, um, you know, so, I mean, you talked about it a little bit earlier, just in terms of your history with Al Vermeil, about having that underlying philosophy, because with all the fluff and smoke and mirrors that kind of come in and out of popularity, you have to have something to kind of fall back on. That's always going to be that foundation, like you alluded to earlier. If you could just go into that a little bit further, I know you talked about it a little bit. If you could just talk about your underlying philosophy, kind of maybe who's had a big foundation or a big, um, uh, I guess, factor in that philosophy, and how that's morphed over the years.
yeah, let's talk about the philosophy first. Again, we're trying to build a better athlete, and for me, that's if you can apply force into the ground in a shorter period of time and absorb that force in a shorter period of time, you're probably going to have a better athlete. And that's a big difference between a high skilled athlete. And sometimes that conversation needs to happen with coaches saying, our job is to own that physical preparation piece of things. Sport coach's job is more so to handle that skill piece of things. And I think that the ability to interpret new information is largely based on that core philosophy. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there's some sport specific things that we can entail that a baseball player's forces through their body are much different than a football player's forces. And so exercise selection in that case has got to be key. But I think with that general philosophy, we take a look at the things that really do improve force production. Things like sprinting, things like jumping, things like plyometrics, weightlifting movements, your snatches, your cleans, your squats, your jerks, your single leg work. All those types of things really do increase that capacity. Now, at the same time, you need to be able to sustain that, whether it's a 60-minute football game, whether it's a basketball game, whether it's a swim meet, you need to be able to sustain that. So there's a conditioning component to that as well. And I think every sport's a little bit different on that front. I think that a lot of new methods come out, and with that core philosophy in mind, I've really been guided by, what fits within that context. I believe strongly in the idea of creative destruction. An economist named Joseph Schumpeter, and I think he was in the 50s or 60s, came to the U.S. and basically, outlined this philosophy and the fact that, you need to operate in which the ground underneath your feet is falling at all times. And so there are some core pragmatic exercises that I really try to keep in my program at all times, but I'm always looking out for what's next, what's better, because ultimately I think there's a possibility that, we could be replacing a lot of our exercises with better ones. 10 years from now, we may not use laptop computers. There's probably something going to be better going to be out there. And what we're doing can be obsolete. At the same time, I want to be pragmatic about it and make sure that I have things that I know work. And I'm not going to switch wholesale changes just because something's new or a coach's suggestion. I want to make sure it's 100% accurate and 100% effective before I make the switch. I'm very open-minded with those things, but at the same time, I want to be pragmatic and choose things that I know work. As far as influences on it, obviously, Al and Eric were a huge influence early in my career. I work with Chris Hartman at Hamlin, who was previously a Minnesota strength coach. I think he was a huge influence as well. And then throughout the time, I think I've stolen a lot of periodization from guys like Mike Stone, Roger Nielsen, who is a weightlifting coach. I've borrowed a lot from him and Mike Catone, and I don't even know if they know how much they've given me in terms of that. Guys like Charlie Francis, guys like Derek Hansen in the sprint environment have been really great. Don Chu, when it came to plyometrics and jumping and things like that, those have been great. But I've also been influenced by a lot of coaches I came from University of Wisconsin, which our head coach was Barry Alvarez, and he, ran his team a certain way. And I went complete opposite way with June Jones at Hawaii, and it was a complete different shift. And so, I've stolen a lot from those coaches. I think I've stolen a lot from business as well. I think it's important to look outside your profession in terms of management and leadership and how to run your program. So there's been a lot of influences throughout the years, and I try to steal a little bit from everybody and try to observe what works and what doesn't, and be adaptable with the information that I choose to use.
Now, are there anything that's impressed you in the last 5-10 years of new technology that you think that's valuable moving forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. I started the profession when, guys like Arthur Jones and Ellington Darlington and the hit people still had their claws in the profession. And I think we've kind of moved to the point where people are doing largely a lot of the same things. I think in terms of technology, I haven't had a huge experience based on a limited budget with the technology that's out there. But I do think there's use for it. I like the idea of jump mats, contact grids. I like the idea of some of the resisted mechanical sprinting equipment out there. I don't think it's always practical in a group setting, but I like the direction that it's headed and what we're able to do with those technologies. I do think bar velocity technology is becoming more common. I don't really subscribe to the velocity-based training philosophy. I don't think it has a whole lot of application, at least in my setting, but I like the idea of those technologies becoming more apparent, being able to take a look at bar path and some of those technologies that are really important as well. But the one thing I think that's really great is video. And we've been able to just pull our phone out of our pocket, grab an iPad, slow things down on that slow motion, have athletes be able to see things. I think that's really big. And what's undersold as well is when you show athletes, some of the elite sprinters, some of the elite weightlifters lifting, it's not something that you could have done 15 years ago. And you can pull it right out of your pocket right now and say, here's exactly what it's supposed to look like. And I think that's been kind of undersold as well. That's a big part of the way I coach, is being able to use that as an example. And those technologies have been great for that.
Yeah, that instant feedback is such an important tool that I think it's underutilized. It's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, what we do in the weight room, if it's not showing up on the field of play, we're kind of wasting our time. So, in your experience, what has been some of the things that you feel like you get the most transfer from in the weight room to the competitive arena?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different things that can be included. Let's just start with lifting. And I think that, when you introduce things like a front squat to an athlete, you're developing quad strength. Having that quad strength in a positive shin angle is really an important thing for an athlete. And so to be able to have those movements in a program early are really important for their development, because if you talk about that ability to apply and absorb force in a positive shin angle, you're talking about acceleration positions. You're talking about a swimmer jumping out of the blocks, a sprinter jumping out of the blocks on a track. You're talking about a basketball player being able to beat somebody off a dribble. That positive shin angle with a large amount of dorsiflexion in the calf, I think it's something the strength coach doesn't pay attention enough. That instantaneous breaking of inertia is huge for most of our sports. You can be decided sport can be decided in instants. And so to have that quad strength, that ability to break inertia, I think is huge. I think that applies to single leg strength as well. Being able to express the strength that you acquire in a front squat position into a straight arm front squat position, into a single leg is really what the carryover is of the sport. And we talk about the ability to apply and absorb force. You're also preventing injury at the same time, because injury happens when force overwhelms the body. And so if you're able to prepare the athletes with that, you've really set them up for success in a lot of different areas. In terms of other exercises that I really do think have a lot of carryover, Sprinting is another one. Sprinting is something that most sports do. And to teach them how to sprint properly is going to obviously reduce their likelihood of injuries, but it's going to make them more efficient as well. You can make them a little bit faster. They've got the ability to work submaximally at a lower percentage. The same thing is true with strength. And so, teaching them to turn it on and teaching them to turn it off and be relaxed at the same time can be a powerful tool for a lot of our sports. So there's a lot of different tools we have, but I think the biggest part of our training that's been very successful in whatever environment it is, it's really been the lifting and the sprinting at the same time. Doing explosive things like snatches, cleans, jumps, all those things have had a lot of carryover. They teach landing mechanics. They're able to utilize that ability to apply that force into power and express speed as the finite result of that. And so I think that all of those movements have a big part in what we do. And that's why I've continued to use them throughout the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Obviously, being exposed to a lot of different sports and a lot of different athletes, are there any must-haves, kind of universal must-haves, like non-negotiables that you need in your program?
I think that we're very firm in philosophy, but flexible in approach. And honestly, if there's any exercise that a coach says, you know what, I can't have that in my program, I'll have the debate. I'll try to talk them off the ledge off of that exercise. I'll try to get as much information as I can that's in relation to their program to really help them out on that. But I would say there's no exercise where I would say, you know what, I can't do my strength conditioning program without this. I guess maybe the one might be sprinting.
Yep.
But the one thing I will say is my perspective being married to a head coach is that, when we're done with our athletes, a lot of times we'll take that home, we'll think about it for a time, but we won't have the problems that a head coach has. And so they have so many problems on their plate to deal with. If they're so anti an exercise and it makes their life a little bit easier, there's no non-negotiables. Al Vermeil always told me, he's like, there should be no absolutes in your program. Everything has a little bit of give and take to it. Obviously, what I want them to squat, what I want them to Olympic lift, what I want them to sprint, change direction, do conditioning, absolutely. But there's no part of that I absolutely have to have in my program no matter what.
Now, you have a unique perspective just in terms of being married to a head coach. In a place like Cal State Bakersfield, everyone's spread a little bit thin, but you still have to develop that relationship with that sport coach. And what are some things and tools you have used to help kind of bridge that gap and create that strong connection with the sport head coach?
Well, I think the first thing is empathy. Like to deal with all the things a head coach deals with is absolutely crazy, from fundraising to hands in marketing to recruiting to all the different problems that happen in our student athletes' lives, to dealing with academics and all those issues that can come up with that. I think the one thing that I'll tell a head coach is I completely understand the boat you're in, because with my wife, I experience a lot of those problems on a daily basis. I've had student athletes call in the middle of the night with a life crisis or a mental health issue and things like that. And so I think when a head coach understands that that can be an issue in their lives, I think they understand that and they welcome that. And that's important. Understanding the sport is really important as well. And I think that even when you don't understand the sport, make it an effort to understand it, whether you're spending more time at practice, whether you're asking questions. I think that's appreciated. And even though it may come across as a little bit ignorant at times, I think they appreciate the effort going forward. So I think make a concerted effort to understand their game plan, their nomenclature, their terminology, understanding what type of kid they recruit, trying to give them feedback whenever possible, I think is really important. But the communication is key in that, and just being, upfront with coaches and being transparent and constant communication as much as possible. And that can be challenged with our lives and as busy as we get and things like that. But that communication piece is huge in that front.
Yeah. Now, you've worked with men's basketball or basketball type athlete for a majority of your career. What has worked well with for you just with dealing with those long lever athletes? What are some tools that you have used and had some success with?
Sure. And the biggest thing with those athletes, and I've taken this from my time as an intern with the Bulls, is progression. Start at really simple exercises that they can manage. Nobody learns how to read by throwing a Tolstoy novel on somebody's lap. Nobody learns how to read by reading War and Peace.
Yep.
So why would you learn how to power clean by having the bar on the ground say get to it? So what we did is break the movements down into simple, easy to learn pieces. And that way an athlete can have success doing it. You have these long lever athletes, and they're a little bit afraid and nervous of the weight room because the first day in the weight room, they've said, hey, go back squat, go try to power clean, go try to do these exercises. And a lot of them don't have the mobility for it. A lot of them don't have the body awareness for it, and those types of things. So it's breaking those movements down in easy, digestible pieces. So if I'm going to clean, I'm going to learn how to muscle clean first. I want to get the wrist flexible enough to receive the bar in a catch position. We're going to snatch. We want to muscle snatch first because we want to be able to handle the overhead strength. We don't want to put them in a position where we're adding a lot of speed and a lot of weight without the stability to match it. Those types of things are really important. You take a 7-foot athlete and try to put a bar on the ground. They just don't have the mobility in the ankles, the T-spine strength, the mobility in the back to be able to do that correctly. And it kind of breaks my heart seeing a lot of coaches just default to, all right, we're just going to trap bar deadlift them, we're going to do single leg work, and we're just going to call it quits. I think that's in our setting, in college setting, that's a little bit of giving up because we have at least 2 to 4 years with these athletes. So take your time, develop them, hold a standard to those each exercises. If they can't do those exercises well, take a step back. See if you can do some extra mobility work with them. See if you can work on extra coaching. I might ask an athlete to come in outside of their group time to work on those movements because, a lot of time the pressure of a group, if you have a freshman or incoming, a JC guy, first time in the weight room, he sees guys lifting huge weights and he can't handle the bar correctly. And a lot of time that turns into an ego hit for these guys. And so what you can do is you can take them outside of that environment and do a lot of work one-on-one because the fear of perception of what's going on around, I'm the weak one in the weight room is gone then. And we can hammer out those technical details. We can figure out a way to do it correctly. And they're right back in the group within no time at all. And once they've had success doing it, they enjoy it. And they start seeing the weight increase. They start seeing the differences on the courts. If you're able to jump a little bit higher, you show a guy, 2 to 3 inch improvement in their vertical jump, that's huge for those guys. And then you start to play other teams and you see like, man, my first step quickness is phenomenal. I'm able to jump. For the first time ever, I've made it through a season without a knee injury. Those types of things really carry a lot of weight. And so one of the things you can do throughout the years is build that culture from senior down to freshman. Like, hey, listen to this guy. He's really helped my career out. I've improved in these areas tremendously. And so, I think that we've had a lot of success and it's just built on the foundation of progression. Everybody changes their body at a different rate. Take your time. Don't be afraid to go up 1 kilo, 2 kilos a week. And that compounded over a long period of time makes a huge difference.
Yeah, one thing you said that I would love for you to unpack a little bit is, especially with those long limb guys, they tend to have stiff ankles, stiff hips. What are some mobility and movement systems that maybe you have used or taken from that you've had a lot of success with?
Yeah, so starting with the ankles, these basketball players land in a plantar flex position a lot. And so as a result, they build up a lot of scar tissue. They build up that tonic calf involvement. And so that calf's kind of stuck in that plantar flex position. So we're talking about deep squatting and deep deadlifting positions. A lot of them just don't have the dorsiflexion to get out of it. And stealing from a guy like Kelly Starrett, who I think has done some great things in making mulligans and tack and floss and all these types of things available to people, we've kind of stolen some things from them. And one of the things we do is we just take a a light bar or a PVC pipe that's really sturdy, and we put it on the top of the gastroc with their knee on a bench, and they'll do some mobility drills, just kind of pressing on top of that calf, increasing the mobility of that.
Nice.
If you're able to get an athlete stronger as well in those positions, the ranges of motion tend to increase. Your body's really, really good at protecting itself. And so a lot of times when those athletes are in that plantar flex position, the body's adapted by locking those positions down to keep outside of a range of motion that's going to injure them. And so if we're able to kind of explore those ranges of motion, say, hey, we're able to build some strength here, you're not going to get hurt, they tend to stick a little bit better. And so starting with the ankle, that's a big one. I'm not sure many people have really any mobility problems in the knee, but just having some quad strength, having some stability in that knee does go a long ways. And once you're able to have those things as an athlete, you're able to start landing correctly. You're able to start moving better. Those compensatory actions are not there. One of the things that we'll do is we'll draw a mountain on a whiteboard for our athletes, and we'll talk about the switchbacks up a mountain. Nobody drives straight up a mountain because they just don't have the horsepower to do it. In an athletic sense, we have a lot of athletes who are tall end up creating a lot of switchbacks. And so if we can kind of correct some of those, we'll get a more direct point from A to B. A lot of these longer athletes especially use their length to move. And so if you talk about like it's a defensive slide position, a lot of them will throw their leading leg out there and then position their body weight over that base of support, rather than applying the force into the ground on the back leg and even the front leg. And so by giving them the horsepower and giving them mobility, we're able to not only help them move faster, but we'll help them move better as well. And so I think a lot of those types of things are important. When it comes to the upper back, again, I go back to trap bar deadlift. People love that exercise because it's easy to implement. But if you take something like a lift off or a deadlift from a tall athlete's perspective, they just don't have the mobility to do it from the floor right off the bat. So what you do is you start with some blocks. You start with 8 to 10 inches of blocks, making sure they can get a nice flat back T-spine position. And as you get a little further along, again, those range of motion are acquired at the T-spine as you develop strength. And so you can do your T-spine mobility stuff on a foam roller, which I think is really important. But if you can backfill it with a little bit of strength, a little bit of pulling, it's much more likely to stick. And so what we'll do with those exercises, again, little by little, we'll take 2 inches off that pulling height, and sooner or later, you'll get a 7-foot guy to get to the ground that way. It takes a lot more time. You really got to keep your eye on an athlete. You got to hold a standard of coaching that it's, I think, important. But the athletes can get there. You just got to have a little bit of faith and a little bit of trust in them and just take your time.
Yeah. I think what you said about, strength being a part of the movement process is often forgotten. Just giving that quad strength and that postural strength helps that movement process quite a bit. And I think that's a underlooked part of the movement, which is, I love that you said that. Recovery has been a big topic lately. It's always kind of a buzzword. What are some things and tools that you get your athletes to buy in to that recovery process? And what are kind of the fundamental recovery tools that you guys use?
Yeah, and I think backing up a little bit from recovery, I think you need to first work on capacity. Our job is first and foremost is to be able to develop the capacity to handle practices, games, things like that. My complaint with some of the monitoring technology is you become very reactive to fatigue, and you're so worried about fatiguing an athlete and the athlete being in a fatigued state. I think we need to take a step back and prepare them, because a lot of that stuff can be worked through. Fatigue, we talk about stress and eustress and de-stress. And if you're putting the right amount of eustress on an athlete, hopefully you're preparing them so that they're able to handle the demands in season. So I'll be honest, we don't do a lot of recovery work, and large part, it depends on our training. If we're able to train in a fashion that prepares us to be able to handle the games, the travel, everything associated with that, I think that's step number one before anything else. We do foam rolling, we do stretching. We talk about the athlete's sleep, their nutrition habits. I think that's all extremely important. Again, I have not done a lot of the monitoring technology. We've done with a couple of our teams looking at GPS data and look at their running volumes. And I think those things are great to look at because they do give you an idea. Like, every now and then we get an athlete who surprises us. We see a 7-mile volume of running in a soccer game, and all of a sudden we say, you know what, we may have to go a little bit lighter. It's a little more of a recovery day for those athletes. But I don't think those things give you something that your eye and your coaching eye and your intuition can't give you if it's placed properly. But I do think all those, external factors like nutrition, sleep, reducing stress are an important part. And we talk about those consistently as much as we can with our athletes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, like you alluded to there, just having a well set up plan is a big part of it. I mean, like you talked about the capacity part, but just having a really good plan. If your plan is adaptive, I think that really helps the recovery process because your athletes just aren't wrecked every single time they come in.
Yeah, and there are a lot of athletes who just don't have the benefit of having that good off-season training base. If you're a freshman coming in, if you're an incoming athlete, obviously this COVID pandemic has really proven that to be the case. And so as a result, you probably have to look a little bit more at being reactive and looking at recovery measures and things like that. But ideally, you want to have that training base to be able to say, you know what, we're prepared to be able to handle all the demands of the season, the practice, and everything that's associated with it. And if we're trained properly, hopefully that's the case.
No question. And just in terms of that low-hanging fruit, like nutrition and sleep, getting the athletes to buy into that, have you had some success with certain things, just getting that buy-in from your athletes?
Yeah, we do things pretty simple here. We don't have the resources for a whole training table and things like that. And so one of the things that we found really effective is we have a leadership committee with all of our athletes. And we give a really simple nuts and bolts nutrition talk. And right before the nutrition talk, I talk about how many athletes here cook their own food. And not many can. They're their first time on their own and they haven't been taught. And if they're on their own, the first thing we do is, I say, okay, who doesn't think they can cook? And you get some hands that raise up. And I said, okay, come on over with me. And so what I do is I just take an Instapot and we throw some chicken in there. We throw some seasoning. I kind of guide them through the process and have them set it. All right, we're going to do some vegetables. We're going to take a bag of steamed vegetables that you can use in the microwave. They can press start in the microwave. We give the nuts and bolts nutrition talk. And then we circle back around after the Instapot and the vegetables are cooked. And the athletes are shocked at how easy some of that stuff is. And so, especially at smaller schools, they just don't have the resources to have the training table. So we got to give them the tools to be able to do it on their own. And I think stuff like that has been really effective for the athletes.
Absolutely. Just in terms of things that you are piquing your interest right now that you're trying to really dig into, is there anything kind of in the forefront of your brain that you've tried to dive into lately?
Yeah, I keep looking at, again, using that idea of kind of creative destruction and trying to look for the next big thing. You see a lot of the velocity-based training. I think there's some smart people behind it. Watched a lot of, Brian Mann stuff and looking at that stuff. And I'll be honest, I don't understand it. And I don't understand it from a different level than just ignorance on the topic. When we talk about the force velocity curve, and that's what a lot of these people kind of cite as the major importance in this velocity-based training. We have force, what's inversely related to velocity. And my issue with that is we're taking a force movement like a squat, like a bench, that's main purpose is to increase the amount of horsepower and force that we produce, but we're using a velocity to limit and to dictate the training of that movement. Now, don't get me wrong, I have no problem measuring bar velocity. I think that's sometimes a good indicator. It's good feedback, especially if we're able to provide some bar path. But if you ask a strength conditioning coach why force and velocity are inversely related, the answers you get are staggering. They really don't have an idea of why they're inversely related. And it's a really simple answer. Actin and myosin can attach and detach. The more motor units you're going to have, the more cross-bridging you're going to have in those myofilaments. And so what happens is if you have a lot of force at a given time, you're engaging a lot of those actin-myosin fibers. They can only detach at a finite rate. And so if you're trying to do a strength movement that's heavy and fast at the same time, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You take a look at an Olympic lifter squat. They're very rhythmic. They're very passive on the bottom. They get a little stretch reflex from the passive structures of the legs. And they really put that force in right when the quads take over, right when the sticking point happens. To artificially try to create velocity coming out of the bottom of a squat, to me, kind of just changes the whole dynamics of the movement. I think the one thing that we can take out of coaches, sport coaches, is they are very, very good at teaching the rhythmic application of force. So if you take a look at a sprint coach, not only are they teaching their athlete to push hard, but at top speeds, when their foot is off the ground, when they're floating, they're relaxed. If you take a look at a baseball player, their hands are relaxed and loose, and the force is starting to generate with the legs, and not until contact are you really tightening up at all. And so that timing is so important on these movements. So whether you're cleaning, you're snatching, you're squatting, that rhythm and timing of force to me is so much more important than the velocity. And to limit yourself or your athletes by saying, well, you're only hitting this velocity, or we're going to limit you weight-wise on this, I don't completely understand. Now, I could be proven 100% wrong by somebody later down the line, and I'm not afraid to admit that. But that's the one thing that I'm really looking at right now is so many people are subscribing to that movement that I think, that's where my interest is peaked right now.
Yeah, interesting. So if you're not going to implore Olympic lifting and you're trying to search for that speed strength or strength speed quality, which I think some of these velocity based are trying to find kind of that strength speed strength quality, do you think if you did speed work and strength work, it would show up in the middle?
I think so. And I think that you're at least providing the framework for that. And when you talk about that middle point, that power point, you're probably going to have to choose exercises that are breaking inertia. So, counter movement, vertical jumps, triple jumps, things like that have that middle kind of quality, as opposed to, you're doing some high velocity type things. But I think there's plenty of room between getting strong and getting fast to be able to develop that power naturally. The one thing I do like, obviously, about Olympic lifts is that power component to it and the timing of it and everything else. I think you can simulate that a little bit with weighted jumps. I'm not a huge fan of weighted jumps because once you start using them, you automatically distort that force velocity a little bit unless you have some very good jumpers or you're keeping an eye on it. If you take a look at, let's say, a basketball player, the best jumpers are the ones that make it look effortless. And their timing is so great that, right when they're ready to extend, they're getting that terminal knee extension, they're getting that summation of force right at the proper time. And I think when you load a jump, a lot of times you distort that. And so that's why I use those very reluctantly, because I think you can much better accomplish it through better types of jumping, whether it's counter movement jumping, broad jumping, triple jumping, plyometrics, things like that, where I think that you can use that natural timing mechanism so much better than you can with a weighted jump. With weightlifting, if it's taught correctly, you do it naturally. You wait until the power position to really apply the force. You do that early, it's not as fast of a lift, it's not as efficient of a lift, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree totally. What you talked about, obviously the sequencing of movement, right? The agonist antagonist rhythm, and how effortlessly a good athlete moves. How do you find that balance between developing the strength but also developing the athleticism?
Yeah, I think that's where it's important to have movements that are fast and movements that have segments that are unloaded. So you take a look at like a snatch. You're on when that power position happens. When that bar is coming up, that's your job to relax, to float underneath it, to get yourself in a position, not to try to pull it over your head. If you're sprinting, teaching your athletes to kind of float when they're in the air, doing extended, bits of sprinting where you're talking about maintaining and just maintaining effortlessly, and really cueing your athletes to be relaxed. Anytime there's a degree of velocity, again, going back to that force velocity curve, you're talking about that actin-myosin. They have to move fairly quickly. And so anytime you're at the high velocity end of things, you really got to be cueing, stay relaxed, stay loose, let it happen fluidly. When you're talking about a high force maneuver, you're talking about really being locked up. You got to be tighter. And I think you see that all the time when you see the difference between a power lifter and a sprinter. Power lifter will grind their teeth, will tighten every muscle in their body to try to accomplish things. Whereas a sprinter at top speed looks just kind of jelly-like in their face and their arms and their hands. Especially the more distal the segment is to the body, I think the more the difference that makes in terms of that velocity as well, because, tight hands will turn into a tight arm. If your foot is tight, the recovery on the sprint isn't going to be as passive as it should be. And I think that's really important, not only in terms of actually expressing the speed that you develop, but also efficiency as well. You talk about the metabolic cost of being tight all the time. And you've seen these athletes, they're trying their ass off. And if they just relaxed, not only would they probably be a little bit faster, but they'd be a little bit more efficient as well. They wouldn't get as tired. And so not only is our job to develop that force and the ability to apply it, absorb it, but also at the same time to express speed, to let it happen. And I think in terms of efficiency and metabolic, the cost of that in some of our athletes is pretty high.
No question. When you deal with a novice athlete, so an athlete that first comes in, what are some really the main things that you really hone in on with that development piece?
I think number one, I go back to Al Vermeil's pyramid, and the first thing you got to do is an evaluation process, and you got to see where they're at. You got to see how they move. You got to make sure that they don't have any medical things that are going to blow up first day one. Aside from that, they have to have a level of work capacity, and so being able to develop that ability to train is important before anything else. And so if you try to implement speed, power without that ability, you're not going to get very far. And so you're just working yourself up the ladder. Nobody jumps on top of a house. Ladders have steps for a reason. We got to take it step by step in that process. And so that work capacity is really big for a new athlete coming off. And a really young athlete may have to spend a lot more time in that work capacity period than somebody who's more advanced, who's been through the training process, who has a much higher training age. And so I think that that's step number 2 as far as the development process. Number 3, I think, is developing strength, because speed can't be expressed, power can't be expressed without that underlying force. I mean, it can, but not very rarely are athletes going to have the ability to accelerate 50 yards before they actually produce on the field. So having the ability to increase the acceleration, that force application, is the next step. And that's really where most of our athletes need the most help. Again, it goes back to why they get injured. That force overwhelms the body. So we'll spend a lot of time there. And then as you get a little further along the training process, we can take a look at strength, speed strength, the expression of speed. That's really where we want to be. But it's taking your time and making sure that we're going step by step, that we're not trying to jump over any steps in the process, because I see that a lot of times leading to obviously going to get some short-term gain out of it, but the long-term athletic development just isn't there.
Yeah. You've been in this industry a long time. Is there anything you feel like as an industry we need to get better at? Like we really need to change our focus, like we're just not hitting the mark yet?
Yeah, I think coaching is the biggest part of it. The actual act of making sure that we're doing the right things the right way. And I think if I look around the country, I would say for the most part, most of everybody's doing the same things, like I said before. And I think they're probably the right things, but they can be done a lot better. Whether it's taking a look at the sprint mechanics, we're just not seeing the expression of hip extension. We're not seeing the dorsiflexion on the foot when we're sprinting. When it comes to Olympic lifting, we're not catching the bar in the right rack position. We're not getting the depth of the squats we need. So, part of that's holding your athletes accountable accountable, but I think a lot of that is just reinforcing throughout the time is, we want to make sure we do things correctly. And we're seeing a lot of athletes do the right movements. They're just not done as well as I think they should be done. Yeah. And so we need to go back to the coaching piece and do a better job with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Is there anything that we just didn't get into that you really kind of want to get out there, or something that just you need to get off your chest, or anything you want to address?
I think for me, the last part of it is the thing that I think as a profession, we need to step back and really reevaluate our coaching process. And I think that at a young age, as a young strength coach, if that's instilled in you early on, I think that really makes a big difference.
True.
I think we have a lot of things that we can improve upon the profession. I think there's a lot of procedural things that we could do better, professionalism things we could do better. But that's the thing that stands out to me the most. The one thing that I'd really like to see from our profession is us getting away from the caricatures of a strength coach. And I think a lot of us understand what that means is the acting like a goof on the sidelines. It's the solely being the hype man. And I think that, the ESPN video that was released last week, that, the ESPN commentators were talking about the bar being set low for strength conditioning coaches. And we need to expect better from ourselves. And so if you have a colleague that you can trust and they're not afraid of the criticism, I think we need to say, like, hey, look, it's okay to be high energy. I get the training environment is a big part of the way we do things and the way I do things as well. I want to make sure we're high energy in the weight room. Guys are having fun, things like that. But to become a caricature of a strength coach in which we're just, making fools of ourselves to make fool of ourselves and yell for yelling's sake, I think we need to fix that. And I think that's one thing that I wish we would reevaluate. Our football coaches that really are looking for that in terms of the hiring process. I'm hoping that changes. Because I think if we can value intellect and coaching, and don't worry, the charisma is important. I believe that as well. We'll keep that, but let's remove all the circus act associated with all that stuff. So those are my two things that I'd really like to see from the profession improve a little bit.
Yeah, it seems like it's becoming a bit of an entertainment industry in that sense, and we're losing the things that matter most. Keeping the main thing the main thing.
Yeah, and let's not forget, like the strength coaches that came before us. They've built a foundation off of coaching. If you take a look at what Alvin Roy did when the profession first started, you take a look at that stuff. It was done extremely well and it was extremely effective. And to reduce it to just creating hype, to just running around, screaming, things like that, I think is doing a disservice to the profession. So, I'd like to see us kind of rein that in a little bit and kind of get a little bit more intellectual, keep the charisma, keep the energy. That's important for athletes. They like that motivation. They like that high energy, but let's do it in a way that makes sense, because the stuff that I've seen so far on the sidelines and things like that, that's got to stop.
Last question for you, Brendon. I know you have a lot to do, but as you guys return from time off with obviously the COVID, what are some things that you guys are going to really kind of dig into when you get back, or kind of be your key ingredients when you first return?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be on our school's opening committee. And I think that really helps in terms of understanding what the layout of the land is. And I think that if a strength coach has been left off that opening committee, that needs to change, because they're an integral part of that return to play and return to sport. So I've been lucky in terms of that. When we come back, I think it's really important that we start slow and then we start right. These athletes have had a long period of time which they haven't been able to lift. They've probably done some general fitness work stuff, but it's not the level we're asking them to. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start right at the basement again. We're going to pretend like they haven't lifted at all, and we're going to start with manageable volumes and exercises to make sure that we're starting slow. Because just because an athlete has cleaned 300 pounds before doesn't mean they're going to be able to do it when they come back. If we talk about the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands, they haven't had any of those imposed demands in the past 3 months. And so things like high velocity, high force maneuvers, they haven't done. And so we're going to start with just general work capacity stuff. We'll evaluate where they're at in terms of health history, a little bit of performance testing when they come back. But we're really going to start with nuts and bolts, and we're going to start and make sure it's easy. I think the last thing that you want to do is to end up on the ESPN ticker saying, you've had athletes with rhabdo and things like that. So we want to take our time and make sure it's done well. We're probably going to reduce our frequency a little bit when they come back, just to allow them some acclimation. The one thing I think that you have in danger of when you have an athlete with a very high training age is they know how to do the movements very well. And so for them, their loads can go up very quickly. And it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. The great thing is, they're going to improve rapidly because they know how to do things. The bad part of that is those forces are high, and those muscles and the muscular system just isn't prepared to that. So you can create a lot of damage within those first couple of weeks if you decide to push it too fast. And so, our job is to really slow the process down, develop a good base of work capacity, and kind of move forward from there. The other thing I think throughout this whole process is we're all going to have to be very, very flexible.
Yeah.
Training is not going to look the same as it's looked. We're looking at different exercises. We're looking at different pieces of equipment that we can't use, because anytime you're talking about a shared use of equipment, you've got to be able to sanitize that piece of equipment. It's tough to sanitize bands and things like that we're using a lot. So we're going to have to find ways around that. So the training process looks a little bit different in terms of exercise selection. And then scheduling wise, it's going to be very, very different. We're going to have to be flexible, and the athletes will be flexible right with us. So I think all those things are important things to factor in. I don't think anybody's got it figured out right now, including me, and that's okay. I think it's just try to fulfill best practices as best you can, be flexible with the process, and use your intellect and judgment throughout the time. And common sense is our best practice moving forward with this.
Well, I think we could talk about this stuff all day, but I appreciate an hour out of your day. I know you're busy and working on this return to activity, but just think the world of you, Brendon. I think you're one of the phenomenal strength coaches out there. Just someone I've respected in my career and look up to. So can't thank you enough for your time and getting on here with us.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's been fun, and I always love the time talking about the profession, and it's one of the things I do enjoy. So I appreciate being on.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon, brother. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.